Everyone knows about the codebreakers, the genius mathematicians hunched over machines at Bletchley Park, cracking German signals one letter at a time. That story gets told over and over, and it deserves to be told. But there is a chapter inside that story, a single operation, a single moment that almost never gets mentioned. And when you hear it, you will not be able to believe that it stayed quiet this long. In the spring of 1941, a small Royal Navy boarding party climbed onto a sinking German weather ship in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. They had about 10 minutes before the vessel went under. Most of them were focused on not dying. One of them grabbed a book, a waterlogged olive-drab code book used by German meteorological teams to encode weather reports. A book so specific, so narrow in its purpose, that most people at the time would not have thought twice about it. But that book, that single water-damaged volume, cracked open something that changed the entire shape of the war at sea. Not for a week, not for a month. For 6 months, every North Atlantic convoy route that the Allies ran was being guided by intelligence, pulled directly out of that one captured document. If you think you know the story of Enigma, you do not know this part. Stick around. And if you have not subscribed yet, do it now, because this is exactly the kind of story we dig into here. Stories that are buried under the famous ones, stories with real stakes, real names, and consequences that reach far beyond what anyone expected at the time. Let us start from the beginning, not from Bletchley Park, not from Alan Turing, but from the ocean, because that is where this story actually lives. The North Atlantic in 1941 was not just water, it was a battlefield unlike any the world had ever seen. There were no trenches, no front lines, no ground to hold. There was only depth, darkness, cold, and steel. German U-boats were operating in coordinated wolf-pack formations, hunting Allied merchant convoys with brutal efficiency. These were not random attacks. They were calculated. The U-boats would spread out in long patrol lines across hundreds of miles of open ocean, wait for a convoy to trip the wire, and then close in from multiple directions simultaneously. The numbers were catastrophic. In the first months of 1941, the Allies were losing ships faster than they could build them. Merchant vessels carrying food, fuel, ammunition, and troops were going to the bottom of the Atlantic at a rate that made planners genuinely question whether Britain could hold on. Churchill later wrote that the only thing that truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. Not the Blitz, not the fall of France, not the threat of invasion. The Atlantic. Because if those supply lines broke, everything else broke with them. And the Germans had a tool that made this campaign devastatingly effective. Enigma. Most people think of Enigma as a single machine used for a single purpose. That is not quite right. Enigma was a family of machines, a system, adapted and modified for different branches of the German military. The Army used one version. The Air Force used another. The Navy, the Kriegsmarine, used a version that was significantly more complex. The naval Enigma had different rotor configurations, different plugboard settings, different protocols. And it was used to coordinate almost every aspect of U-boat operations, including the routing of submarines to intercept specific convoys, the organization of wolf-pack positions, and the transmission of weather reports. The weather reports are where this story begins to get interesting. Weather in the North Atlantic was not just a matter of comfort, it was a matter of military survival, for both sides. Convoys needed weather intelligence to plan their routes, to know when conditions would help or hinder air cover, to estimate when fog or storm would provide natural camouflage or strip it away. U-boats needed weather data, to know where to position themselves, to understand surface conditions before surfacing to recharge batteries, and to coordinate with command about patrol area viability. The Germans had built a network of weather reporting ships, small, relatively inconspicuous vessels disguised to look like fishing trawlers or civilian boats, positioned out in the deep Atlantic to take readings and transmit them back to Germany via encoded Enigma signals. These ships were called weather observation ships, or in German, Wetterschiffe. They operated in remote areas of the ocean, far from convoy routes, using codes that were considered low priority by both sides. The Germans did not think anyone would care much about weather codes. The British knew that was exactly why they mattered. Here is why. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park had been working on naval Enigma for months, but they were hitting walls that the Army and Air Force codes did not present. Naval Enigma used something called the short weather cipher, a compressed code format specifically for meteorological transmissions. These short-coded bursts were sent frequently, sometimes multiple times per day, which meant they were an extraordinarily rich source of raw material for codebreakers trying to crack the daily Enigma settings. If you could figure out the plain text content of those short weather reports, because weather follows patterns and the reports followed strict formatting, you could potentially work backward to the day's Enigma settings and then use those settings to decrypt everything else being sent on the naval network that day. But to do that, you needed the actual codebook, the physical document that showed you what each weather code grouping meant in plain language. Without it, even knowing that a message was a weather report was not enough to make the mathematical leap. The people who understood this most clearly were working in a unit called Naval Intelligence Division, and one of the key figures pushing for what became known as a pinch operation was a man named Ian Fleming. Yes, that Ian Fleming. Before he wrote James Bond, he was a naval intelligence officer with a particular talent for creative, occasionally reckless operational thinking. Fleming had drafted a plan he called Operation Ruthless, which involved crashing a captured German aircraft into the English Channel, waiting to be rescued by a German patrol vessel, and then seizing the vessel's Enigma equipment in the confusion. The plan was never executed, partly because no suitable German aircraft could be acquired, and partly because it was, by almost any objective measure, insane. But it showed the level of desperation and creativity that British intelligence was operating with. The capture that actually worked was less dramatic in its planning and more dramatic in its execution. It happened in May of 1941, and its name was Operation Primrose. The target was a German weather ship called the München. She was operating in the Norwegian Sea, well north of the main convoy routes, transmitting weather reports back to German Naval Command using a specific set of Enigma settings designated for meteorological use. British intelligence had been tracking the München for some time, aware that weather ships like this one would be carrying the very codebooks that Bletchley Park desperately needed. The operation involved 3 Royal Navy destroyers, HMS Somali, HMS Bedouin, and HMS Eccles. They were dispatched from Scapa Flow in late May with strict orders about how the operation should proceed. This was not a simple attack and sink mission. This was a precision capture. The ships were ordered to approach the München at high speed to prevent the crew from destroying their codes and equipment. Every second of warning the Germans got was a second they could use to throw codebooks overboard or trigger the destruction protocols that all Enigma-equipped vessels were supposed to follow in the event of capture. The approach worked. The boarding party from HMS Somali reached the München before the crew could complete their destruction procedures. What they found on board was significant. The crew had managed to throw some materials overboard and destroy some equipment. But in the scramble, they had not gotten everything. The boarding party recovered the current month's Enigma settings, documents related to German naval operations in the area, and, critically, a copy of the short weather cipher codebook. This was not a complete haul. The settings recovered were for June 1941 specifically, meaning their usefulness had a time limit. But even a short window of readable naval Enigma was enormously valuable. At Bletchley Park, the material was rushed to Hut 8, the unit responsible for cracking naval Enigma, where Alan Turing and his team worked. The settings from the München allowed them to read June naval Enigma traffic with a clarity they had not previously achieved. But June was almost over by the time the material reached Bletchley in fully usable form, and when July arrived, the settings changed, and the advantage evaporated. The codebreakers needed more, not just more codebooks, but more current ones, and if possible, material that would give them insight into how the weather cipher worked over longer periods. Because the ultimate goal was not just to read messages. The ultimate goal was to understand the system well enough to break it without captured material. The captured material was a ladder. The codebreakers needed to climb high enough that they could eventually remove the ladder and still stay up. That understanding shapes what happened next. Because the next capture, which came just weeks later, was not a repetition of the München operation. It was something different in almost every way, and it produced results that lasted far, far longer. In late June of 1941, another set of Royal Navy destroyers was dispatched to intercept a second German weather ship. This one was called the Lauenburg. She was operating in the Iceland-Faroe Gap, another remote stretch of ocean that the Germans used for weather observation. The operation followed a similar pattern to the München capture: fast approach, boarding under fire, desperate scramble through the vessel before she sank. But the timing was different, and the material recovered was different. The Lauenburg was boarded on June 28, 1941. The boarding party had even less time than the München team. The ship was already taking on water. The crew had deployed scuttling charges, and the men going aboard knew they were working against a countdown. What they pulled out in those frantic minutes included July's Enigma settings, additional meteorological cipher documents, and another copy of the short weather cipher book. This one was in better condition than anything recovered from the München. When this material reached Bletchley Park, something clicked that had not clicked before, because combined with the München material and with the additional context provided by the Lauenburg documents, Hut 8 now had what they needed to begin reading naval Enigma, not just for individual days, but in a sustained, systematic way. The weather cipher book was the key piece. It let them reconstruct how the short weather reports were formatted, what each code group represented, and how those reports could be used as cribs, known plain text fragments that could be fed into the bomb machines to narrow down the day's rotor settings. For the next 6 months, the Allies read German naval Enigma with a consistency they had never previously achieved, and that consistency was not just an intelligence advantage, it translated directly into convoy routing decisions that saved ships, saved lives, and kept Britain's supply lines functioning at a moment when they were critically close to failure. To understand how direct that translation was, you need to understand how convoy routing worked in 1941. When a merchant convoy was assembled to cross the North Atlantic, its route was not fixed in advance. It was dynamic, constantly adjusted based on intelligence about where U-boats were operating. The submarine tracking room in London, run by a brilliant officer named Roger Wynne, was the nerve center of this process. Wynne and his team collected every available piece of intelligence about U-boat positions, direction-finding intercepts, survivor reports from ships that had been attacked, aerial sightings, and, when available, decrypted Enigma signals. When Enigma traffic was readable, Wynne could see German naval communications that described where U-boats had been ordered to position themselves, which patrol lines were being established, which areas were being designated as hunting grounds. He could then work with the convoy commodores and the Western Approaches Command to redirect convoys around those threat zones before the submarines even arrived. This is what the captured weather cipher book made possible at scale. Because when Bletchley could consistently break the naval Enigma settings each day, Wynne's team got a daily window into German naval planning. Not always complete, not always in time to act on every piece of information, but consistent enough, reliable enough, that convoy routing became something like chess rather than something like gambling. Between July 1941 and the end of that year, the loss rate of merchant ships in the North Atlantic dropped significantly compared to the preceding months. The drop was not uniform. There were still terrible losses. There were still convoys that ran into wolf packs despite every effort to route around them. The ocean is vast, intelligence has gaps, and U-boat commanders were skilled, aggressive, and sometimes unpredictable. But the trend was unmistakable. Fewer ships were being sunk per convoy, and the wolf pack tactics that had been so devastating in late 1940 and early 1941 were working less reliably. The Germans noticed. They could not understand why their wolf packs were finding empty ocean where convoys should have been. They ran internal investigations. They looked at their own security procedures. They interrogated their own officers. They examined the possibility of leaks at the ports where convoys departed, suspicious that British spies might be reporting sailing times and routes. They considered the possibility of aerial surveillance, even though British air coverage in the mid-Atlantic was extremely limited in 1941. What they did not seriously consider, what they could not bring themselves to seriously consider, was that their Enigma communications were being read. This was not German arrogance exactly. It was a reasonable technical assessment. The mathematical complexity of naval Enigma, with its expanded rotor sets and changing configurations, made the idea of a sustained break genuinely seem like an impossibility. Their own cryptographic experts had told them so. And so when convoys evaded wolf packs, the Germans looked for human intelligence failures, procedural breakdowns, loose lips and visible signals, rather than a fundamental compromise of their communications. That assumption protected Ultra, as the Allies called their Enigma intelligence, for years. But the protection was always fragile. It depended on the Allies never doing anything that could only be explained by signals intelligence. If a convoy that had no reason to change course suddenly turned 90 degrees directly away from a U-boat patrol line that had just been established, and if that happened repeatedly, eventually someone would start asking the right questions. This is why the routing decisions based on Ultra were always layered with cover stories. Convoys were supposedly rerouted because of aerial reconnaissance reports, even when no aircraft had actually spotted anything. U-boat contacts were supposedly attributed to increased patrol activity, even when no patrol had made contact. The intelligence community built an elaborate architecture of plausible alternative explanations to conceal the fact that they were reading the mail. The weather cipher capture was central to this process in a way that went beyond just providing raw intelligence. The specific nature of the weather cipher, its regularity, its predictability, its use of standardized formats that change slowly compared to operational codes, made it the most reliable entry point into the daily Enigma settings. Hut-8 could use the weather reports as a foundation, crack the day's settings using those predictable cribs, and then use those same settings to read the operational traffic that told them where the submarines were. It was a cascade. One captured book unlocked one cipher. One cipher unlocked the daily settings. The daily settings unlocked everything else. 6 months of convoy routing intelligence. 6 months of knowing, more often than not, where the danger was. Now let us talk about the people who did this boarding operation, because they do not get nearly enough attention. The men who climbed aboard sinking German vessels in the North Atlantic in 1941 were not told why they were doing it. They were not briefed on Enigma. They were not told that the documents they were grabbing might change the course of the war. They were told to board a hostile vessel, grab everything that looked like it might be signals equipment or code books, and get off before the ship sank or blew up. The why was classified far above their clearance level. Lieutenant Tony Fasson was one of those men. He was aboard HMS Petard, a destroyer that was involved in a different but related capture operation in October 1942. The seizure of material from a German U-boat designated U-559. Fasson dove into the sea to board the sinking submarine and passed documents up through the hatch to a colleague. He stayed too long trying to retrieve additional material. The submarine sank with him inside it. He was 29 years old. He was awarded the George Cross posthumously. The men who boarded the München and the Lauenburg in 1941 came home. But they boarded ships that were sinking under enemy fire, with no guarantee of success and no real understanding of what success would mean. That combination of risk and ignorance is one of the more striking aspects of the whole story. The people who took the greatest physical risks were not permitted to know what their risks were in service of. The secrecy went to extraordinary lengths. When material was recovered from a captured vessel, it was rushed back under armed escort, separately from the crew of the capturing ship, to prevent even accidental contamination of the secret. The boarding party members were debriefed individually and told in the clearest possible terms that they were never to discuss what they had done or what they had found. Many of them did not for decades. Some took it to their graves without ever knowing that the book they grabbed in 10 minutes of freezing chaos had redirected the entire supply strategy of the Allied war effort for half a year. There is something worth sitting with in that. The gap between the scale of a consequence and the visibility of the action that produced it. One waterlogged codebook, grabbed by men who did not know its significance, changed the routing of thousands of ships and the survival odds of thousands of sailors who would never know why their convoy had taken a detour into a stormy area that happened to be well north of where 6 U-boats were waiting. The flow of ultra-intelligence from the weather cipher capture did not last forever. Captured settings expired on their own, and even with the analytical framework that the codebook provided, Bletchley needed continuous access to fresh material to keep the system running. The daily grind of code breaking was exactly that, a grind, and there were periods in 1941 where gaps opened up and the submarine tracking room had to operate on older intelligence and educated guesses. There was also the ongoing challenge of what the codebreakers called blackouts. Periods where naval Enigma traffic could not be broken because the settings had changed in ways that the available cribs could not crack quickly enough. These blackouts were agonizing for Roger Wynne and his team. Routing decisions made in the dark were routing decisions made on probability and instinct rather than intelligence. And when those decisions were wrong, ships died. But between July and December of 1941, the blackouts were shorter and less frequent than they had been in the preceding period. And this was directly attributable to the analytical advantage provided by the weather cipher material. The codebreakers had a foundation they had not had before. They knew how the meteorological traffic was formatted. They knew which code groups corresponded to which weather observations. They could use the predictable, regular structure of these reports as a lever to pry open the daily settings, even when other cribs were unavailable. This is the precise mechanism by which one captured book changed 6 months of convoy routing. It was not that the book contained secret information about where U-boats were. It was that the book made it possible to read the signals that contained that information. It was a key, not a map. But in a war where the map changed every day and the only way to read it was through encrypted radio signals, a key was worth more than almost anything else. The broader Ultra operation produced intelligence that historians estimate shortened the war in Europe by somewhere between 2 and 4 years. That estimate varies depending on who you ask and how you model the counterfactual, but virtually no serious military historian disputes that Ultra was a decisive strategic advantage. And nested inside that broader advantage is the specific contribution of the North Atlantic Campaign, where the weather cipher break gave the Allies 6 months of sustained convoy routing intelligence at the exact moment when the Battle of the Atlantic was most delicately balanced. There is a way to think about compounding consequences in history. Some events produce direct effects that are large and obvious. Others produce enabling effects that are less visible but potentially larger. The weather cipher capture was an enabling event. Its direct effect was modest, a handful of documents recovered from a sinking ship. Its enabling effect was months of readable naval Enigma, which enabled better convoy routing, which enabled more ships to reach Britain, which enabled more fuel and food and munitions and troops to arrive, which enabled the entire Allied war effort in the European theater to continue operating at a level that would have been impossible if the U-boats had been allowed to operate with the same effectiveness they had shown in the early months of 1941. That chain of consequences runs through one codebook. To really understand what was at stake in those 6 months, you need to picture what the North Atlantic actually looked like operationally in the summer and fall of 1941. You need to understand the geography of the battle, the logistics of convoy construction, and the tactical reality that both sides were operating under. Convoys assembled at Halifax in Canada and at Liverpool and other British ports. The transatlantic runs varied in composition, but generally included anywhere from 20 to 60 merchant vessels, escorted by Royal Navy and later Royal Canadian Navy warships. These were not fast ships. Convoy speed was set by the slowest vessel in the group, often around 7 or 8 knots. A transatlantic crossing could take 2 weeks or more, and for much of that time the convoy was in waters where U-boats operated freely. The Mid-Atlantic Gap was the most dangerous stretch. This was an area of ocean beyond the range of land-based air cover, where convoys had no air protection and could be hunted by U-boats with relative impunity. Closing the Mid-Atlantic Gap was one of the great strategic challenges of the Battle of the Atlantic, and it was not fully resolved until 1943, when very long-range aircraft became available in sufficient numbers. In 1941, the gap was real and deadly. Inside that gap, convoy routing was the primary defensive tool available. If you could not protect a convoy with aircraft, the best alternative was to route it away from where the submarines were. And that required knowing where the submarines were, which required readable Enigma, which required the weather cipher codebook. See how all of it connects. The submarine tracking room under Roger Wynne was remarkably sophisticated in how it used the available intelligence. Wynne was a barrister before the war, a man with a legal mind trained to evaluate evidence, weigh probabilities, and make judgments under uncertainty. He was not a mathematician, not a signals intelligence specialist, but he understood how to read a complex picture and make decisions about it. He had a gift for what his colleagues called the feel for a situation, an intuitive sense for how the overall pattern of German submarine activity was developing that went beyond what the raw intelligence data could directly support. When Ultra was available, Wynne had hard data to anchor his intuitions. He could see German orders directing submarines to specific patrol lines and adjust convoy routes accordingly. When Ultra was not available, or when it arrived too late to act on, Wynne fell back on pattern analysis, inference from direction-finding intercepts, and calculated guesses based on what the Germans had done in similar situations before. During the period of reliable weather cipher intelligence, from roughly July through December of 1941, Wynne and his team successfully rerouted a significant number of convoys around developing Wolfpack positions. The exact number is difficult to establish with precision because the historical records of convoy rerouting decisions are complex, and the causal chain between a specific intelligence signal and a specific routing decision is not always clearly documented. But the operational logs of the submarine tracking room from this period show a sustained pattern of convoy diversions being implemented in response to Enigma traffic, and the correlation between those diversions and reduced ship losses is documented by naval historians who have studied this in detail. What is striking when you read those records is how narrow the margins were. A convoy diverted around a wolf pack might pass within 100 miles of submarines that were actively searching for it. The difference between catastrophic loss and safe passage was sometimes a matter of the timing of a signal decryption, the speed with which a routing instruction reached the convoy commodore, the readiness of the convoy to execute a course change, and the pure chance of ocean conditions that affected both visibility and U-boat detection capabilities. The weather cipher break did not make those margins comfortable, it made them survivable, which in the context of the Battle of the Atlantic in 1941 was as much as anyone could ask for. There is another dimension to this story that rarely gets the attention it deserves. The effect of the weather cipher capture was not limited to routing decisions. It also informed the Allies about the structure and methods of the German Naval Weather Observation Network itself, which had operational implications that went beyond any specific convoy. By reading the weather ship's traffic and understanding how the short weather cipher operated, British naval intelligence gained weather reports using the same system, which continued to provide Bletchley with the cribs they needed to break the daily set. The period of weather cipher-enabled intelligence had not just produced convoy routing advantages. It had also produced a body of analytical knowledge about how naval Enigma was being used, what kinds of traffic patterns existed, what words and phrases appeared most often in naval communications, that made Hut 8 significantly more capable than it had been before the first pinch operation. You cannot easily separate the direct operational benefits of the weather cipher break from the longer-term analytical benefits, but the people who were there, who were working in Hut 8 during this period, were clear in their subsequent accounts that the captured material was transformative, not just for convoy routing but for the entire Hut 8 operation. It changed what they knew, and it changed what they knew they could do. Dilly Knox, one of the great cryptanalysts of the early war period, had been working on Enigma since before the war. He understood the machine at a level that almost no one else did. But naval Enigma had resisted even Knox's formidable skills because of its additional complexity. The weather cipher material did not solve naval Enigma through cryptanalytic genius. It solved it through physical capture, through the oldest method in the intelligence tradecraft, getting your hands on the actual documents. And that physical solution then enabled the mathematical solution that the pure cryptanalysts could not reach on their own. The interplay between human intelligence, the pinch operations, and signals intelligence, the code breaking, is one of the most important and underappreciated aspects of the Allied intelligence effort in World War II. The public narrative tends to privilege either the daring human operations or the brilliant mathematical work, depending on which story is being told. The reality is that neither worked without the other. The mathematicians could not break naval Enigma without the physical codebooks. The physical codebooks could not have been exploited without the mathematicians. The boarding parties made the code breaking possible, and the code breaking made the boarding parties worth the risk. That mutual dependency runs through the entire 6-month period we are examining. Every convoy that was successfully rerouted around a wolf pack during those months represents both a physical act of seamanship and an intellectual act of cryptanalysis. The sailors who changed course, and the mathematicians who told them why, are part of the same operation, even though they never met, never communicated directly, and most of them never knew the other existed. This is worth spending a moment on, because it captures something fundamental about how the war was actually won. Not through any single decisive act, but through the layered, mutually reinforcing efforts of thousands of people across dozens of institutions, many of whom were operating without full knowledge of what the others were doing. The intelligence world had walls. The operational world had walls. The political world had walls. Information moved through those walls slowly, selectively, and in carefully controlled ways, and yet somehow the system worked. Not perfectly, not without enormous cost, but well enough to produce an outcome that had seemed genuinely uncertain as late as the summer of 1941. The question of how close Britain came to losing in 1941 is one that historians have debated at length. Some argue that the strategic fundamentals, American economic support, Soviet resistance, the limits of German resources, made a British defeat ultimately unlikely, regardless of what happened in the Atlantic. Others argue that the supply situation in 1941 was so precarious that a sustained increase in merchant shipping losses could have forced a change in British strategic position that would have fundamentally altered the shape of the war. The truth probably lies somewhere in between those positions, as it usually does. But wherever you locate yourself on that spectrum, the Battle of the Atlantic matters. And inside the Battle of the Atlantic, the 6 months of weather cipher-enabled convoy routing matter. And inside those 6 months, the 10 minutes on a sinking German weather ship matter. The book matters. Let us also consider for a moment the geography of where this was happening. The Norwegian Sea and the Iceland-Faroe Gap, where the München and Lauenburg were operating, are some of the most hostile waters in the world. In late June, which is when both captures occurred, those waters are cold but not frozen, which actually means the weather is highly variable and can deteriorate rapidly. The boarding parties were operating in conditions that combined the physical danger of boarding a sinking vessel under potential fire with the environmental danger of hypothermia and rough seas. The vessels themselves were not large. Weather ships like the München and Lauenburg were relatively small, much smaller than a destroyer, and they sat low in the water. Boarding a vessel that is actively sinking means working in a space that is tilting, flooding, potentially explosive if the crew has set demolition charges. You are moving through corridors that may be filling with water, searching for documents that look like the right kind of documents in a language you may not speak well, under time pressure that has no reliable clock attached to it because you cannot know how fast the ship is going down. The men who did this were not selected from Special Forces units. They were ordinary Royal Navy sailors and junior officers. They had training for boarding operations, but no specific experience with this kind of targeted document retrieval. They were improvising in a high-stakes situation with incomplete information, and the constant awareness that the ship under their feet was going to the bottom of the ocean, whether they were on it or not. That context matters when we think about what the weather cipher capture produced. The 6 months of convoy routing advantage did not come from a carefully planned intelligence operation with months of preparation and the best available technology. It came from men with handheld torches in flooding corridors, grabbing documents that they hoped were the right ones, and getting back to their ship before they drowned. The relationship between planning and chance in intelligence work is never comfortable, and the history of Ultra illustrates it repeatedly. Some of the most important captures were products of meticulous planning. Others were products of opportunism, improvisation, and luck. The weather cipher falls somewhere in the middle, a planned operation that succeeded because the execution was good, and the luck, for once, ran the right way. After the summer of 1941, the pinch operations continued. The Royal Navy and later combined Allied operations would execute additional targeted captures, the most famous of which produced material from German submarines rather than surface ships. The October 1942 capture from U-559 in the Mediterranean, in which Tony Fasson died, produced material that helped break the four-rotor version of naval Enigma that the Germans had introduced earlier that year, a version that had created a blackout period for Hut 8 that lasted most of 1942 and was associated with devastating convoy losses. That story is its own chapter, but it is part of the same book. The book of operations where physical courage produced cryptographic intelligence that shaped the operational decisions of an entire naval campaign. The pattern is consistent. Identify what you need to read. Find the physical material that will help you read it. Get your hands on it at whatever cost. Exploit it before the enemy realizes what has happened, and use the resulting intelligence to direct the operational decisions of a war being fought by millions of people who know nothing about how those decisions are being made. It is an extraordinary system, extraordinary in its complexity, extraordinary in its secrecy, extraordinary in its human cost. When we talk about Bletchley Park today, we talk mostly about the mathematical achievement, the genius of the code breakers, the elegance of the bomb machines, the intellectual triumph of cracking a cipher that its creators believed to be unbreakable. And those things are real. The intellectual achievement was genuine and remarkable. But the full story includes the boarding parties. It includes the men who died and the men who almost died, getting their hands on the material that made the mathematical achievement possible. It includes the weather ships and the code books and the freezing water and the 10 minutes that changed 6 months of convoy routing. The full story is bigger than any single part of it. Which is why, when you hear someone say that they know the story of Enigma, you might want to ask them, do you know about the weather book? Because there is a specific thing that happened in late June of 1941 in the Norwegian Sea. A ship was sinking, men were boarding it, one of them grabbed a book, and because of that book, convoys that would have sailed into wolf-pack ambushes sailed around them instead. Ships that would have gone to the bottom arrived in British ports. Fuel that would have been lost fueled aircraft that flew missions. Food that would have sunk fed people who lived to keep working. The chain of consequence runs outward from that moment in directions that are impossible to fully trace. That is what a pinch operation looks like when it works. Not a fireworks display, not a dramatic moment of revelation. A man in a flooding corridor, grabbing a book, in 10 minutes, in the dark, in the cold, not knowing what it was worth. It was worth 6 months. It was worth every convoy that made it through. It was worth more than anyone standing in that corridor could possibly have imagined. And that is the thing about the decisions and actions that actually change the course of history. They almost never announce themselves. They happen in moments that feel, to the people inside them, like improvisation and desperation. The weight only becomes visible later, when someone looks back and traces the lines forward from that moment and sees where they led. The lines from the weather cipher capture led through Bletchley Park, through the submarine tracking room, through the Convoy Commodore's communications, through the course changes of ships in the mid-Atlantic, through the ports of Liverpool and Halifax and New York, through the supply lines of an entire theater of war. All from one book, all from 10 minutes, all from men who did not know what they had done until long after the war was over, if they ever knew at all. The Battle of the Atlantic did not end in 1941. It continued through 1942 and into 1943, with periods of catastrophic Allied loss and periods of renewed advantage. The turning point, if you want to assign one, is usually placed in May 1943, when U-boat losses became so severe that Admiral Dönitz temporarily withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic. That withdrawal marked the strategic defeat of the German submarine campaign, even though U-boats continued to operate and continued to sink ships until the very end of the war. But May 1943 was built on foundations laid much earlier. The analytical frameworks developed in 1941, the operational experience accumulated by the convoy escort forces, the relationships between Bletchley and the submarine tracking room and the Western Approaches Command, the growing understanding on the Allied side of how to fight the Battle of the Atlantic, not just ship by ship, but as a systemic campaign with intelligence, routing. Entry into the war was not yet certain. In that context, 6 months of reliably readable naval Enigma was not a minor advance.